so evil and so violent that they can just do magic. It's because they don't fight alone. They get military training and military strategy from a crucial side of support. That is the Sunni generals who once led Saddam Hussein's army. These were the same generals who were the first ones fired. The first thing the US did when it occupied Iraq was to dissolve the military. Second thing it did was to dissolve the civil service. Both of them had Sunnis at the top because Sunnis were privileged under Saddam Hussein's rule. But both of them were very nationalist, secular institutions. The most secular, the most nationalist, arguably, in the country. What's the first thing the US does? Get rid of both of them. And install instead a sectarian-based political system where you have sect-based parties, a Sunni party, a Shia party, a Kurdish party, a Christian party, a Turkoman party, etc., etc. And then we're surprised that a sectarian civil war arrives from the result of that. But what happens when you have a bunch of generals who are pretty angry about having been turned out of their high-ranking positions? They no longer have their fancy salaries, they no longer have a job, they have no way to support their family. They are pretty angry. And they've been angry for 10 years. And they've decided, a lot of them, that ISIS is their way out, their way to get back at this government, to get back at the United States, and maybe get back to power in Iraq. They don't believe in what ISIS stands for. These guys, I've met a few of them in the past, they're pretty secular. They drink, they smoke, God knows what else they do, I don't want to think about it. But they are not particularly religious or theologically in agreement with anything ISIS stands for. They see ISIS as representing Sunni interests in Iraq, and they're fighting against a Shia-dominated government. That's their participation. The same for the Sunni tribal leaders in Iraq. Not all of them, thankfully, but a lot see the best way they can support their community, the tribal groups that they lead, is to put their militias in the interest of ISIS, to fight alongside ISIS. So they're bringing ground troops to ISIS. That's why ISIS is so strong. It's because they don't fight alone. They have support from people who absolutely hate what they stand for, but see them as the lesser evil to be allied with for the moment. That's the challenge of all this. So in response to that, we now see this huge escalation. The Russians have escalated, the French. It's like Putin and Hollande are both channeling George Bush, that you're subject to a terrible terrorist attack, and in response, you escalate and you go to war against the people you say did it, which is going to make everything worse. It's like they learn no lesson. They learn no lesson. This is all a disaster. For Turkey, which is now escalating its attacks, it's mainly using its claim to be going after ISIS. It's not mostly going after ISIS. There's every interest that it's allowing ISIS to be crossing its borders at will. It's using it as a way to go against the Kurds, the Syrian Kurds and the Iraqi Kurds, both of whom are the communities that have actually saved lives on the ground. In 2014, when the US government finally responded to what we used to call the CNN factor, and now we maybe call it the Twitter factor, when there was such desperate pressure from people seeing what was happening to the Iraqi Kurds being held on Mount Sinjar, the Yazidi community, and they were facing a very serious crisis, a really serious human rights violation. For all the right reasons, people responded to that and said, we've got to do something. The US said, okay, we're on the way, send the Marines. They sent the bombers. In fact, only 2 of those bombing raids actually were anywhere near Mount Sinjar. The others were all up near Erbil, where the oil fields are, which is what the US was actually worried about. But that's not what the Twitter campaign was about. It was about saving people in Mount Sinjar. Luckily, the people on Mount Sinjar didn't depend on the United States. They depended on the Kurdish militias, who actually did save them, who were able to open up a corridor on the back part of the mountain, escorted them off the mountain, back into Syria along the border, and then back into Iraq where it was safe. That's who saved the Yazidis on Mount Sinjar, not the US bombing. So that's what we're looking at here. We have some potential hopeful news. The talks that have been going on in Vienna and that are scheduled to resume have some hope of doing what none of the earlier efforts, the Geneva I and Geneva II talks and others, have never been able to get beyond step one. Mainly, I mean, there's a bunch of reasons why they failed, but one of the biggest is that the US refused to allow Iran to be at the table. Now, you want to talk stupid? Stupid is trying to get a diplomatic solution to a multi-party struggle, a multi-party catastrophe, by deliberately excluding one of the major players, whether you like them or not isn't the issue. They're one of the major military players, deliberately excluding them, so you're essentially giving them permission to violate whatever agreement you come to with everybody else. That's real smart. You know, there's the former Senator George Mitchell, who helped run the Good Friday negotiations in Northern Ireland. When he finished that very difficult, very painful negotiation process, he said the lesson we learned here is that if you're serious about diplomacy, everybody has to be at the table. You can't exclude somebody because you think they're terrorists. Not because you're going to believe them necessarily, not because you trust them, not because you like them, precisely because you don't. That's why they have to be at the table, so they can be held accountable for whatever decisions get made. The same thing is true here. Now sometimes when I say that, somebody comes back and says, you're not saying we should negotiate with ISIS, are you? The reality is I'm not. I'm not right now. It's not either viable on the ground, it's not politically viable, it doesn't make any sense, and there's absolutely no indication right now that ISIS has any interest in negotiating with anybody. They're doing pretty well right now without it. What we need to be doing is talking with and imposing pressure on the forces who are enabling ISIS. Saudi Arabia, number one. Qatar, number two. Turkey, number three. All of our alleged allies are the ones who are allowing ISIS to function. Some by directly arming and paying organizations that are turning all their weapons over to ISIS, some by keeping their borders open, allowing free passage. There's a whole bunch of ways. And they have no particular interest in changing that. The way it's going to have to change is when the US gets serious and says to the Saudis, you keep sending money, or in this case, because we don't know if the money is coming from the king, from government-sponsored institutions, from some wealthy individuals. We know it's coming from Saudi Arabia. We don't know exactly from where. But we do know it's a tightly enough controlled country that if the king and his Mukhabarat, the secret police, which are very powerful in Saudi Arabia, if they chose to crack down on that money transfer, they could absolutely do it. The US has not tried to get them to do that. Because they would say no, and then the US would be faced with, are we prepared to say, okay, then no more weapons for you. The $60 billion weapons deal that the US signed with Saudi Arabia, a bunch of that stuff is still in the pipeline. No more, you're not getting any more of that. And this $1.3 billion deal that's now being negotiated to send $1.3 billion worth of smart bombs to Saudi Arabia so they can use them in Yemen, where they have brought the entire population to the brink of famine, where 80% of this already impoverished population is now relying solely on food aid to survive. That's who we want to give smart bombs to? How smart is that? It wouldn't take much for the Obama administration to have a little more backbone and say to the Saudis, no dice until you crack down on the transfer of money. What would it take to get Obama and all the European leaders and the Russians to crack down on all the oil companies that are buying and selling ISIS oil? The territory that ISIS controls in Syria includes a lot of the oil fields. Syria is not a major oil producer by Middle East standards, but by world standards, it's not chump change either. It's a decent producer of oil. That's where a lot of the money that ISIS gets comes from. They have a lot of sources, but that's one of them. There's room to pressure the oil companies. What it takes is political will and political courage. We're not seeing enough of that these days. So the talks are the one hopeful piece. We know what policy should look like, but right now we're dealing here with the refugee crisis. The refugee crisis that's real is not the refugee crisis here. As I said before, this is a crisis here, a crisis of racism. It's not a crisis of refugees. In the entire almost 5 years of the Syrian war, we have taken 1,800 refugees to this country. Overwhelmingly children, women, and old people. Only 2% of them are young men. 2% of a number, 1,800, 10 times that number is crossing into Europe every day. We have taken 5 years to bring that many people to the United States. That is shameful. That is shameful. The real refugee crisis is not even in Europe. The real refugee crisis is being felt in the countries surrounding Syria, where the millions of Syrians have found refuge. 2 million plus in Turkey, 1.25 million plus in Lebanon, 1 million plus in Jordan. These are poor countries. In Lebanon right now, 1 out of every 4 people is a Syrian refugee. Imagine, it would be about, I think about 85 million Canadians somehow appeared in our country within 2 years with nothing but the clothes on their back. And they came in the summer and they're facing a winter. What would we do? And we're the richest country that ever existed in the face of the earth. Lebanon is far from that. And they have the equivalent. 1 out of every 4 people in the country today is a Syrian refugee. It's a huge, real crisis. There was a very important statement recently by the European foreign policy chief. I'm forgetting her first name, Mogherini, Federica Mogherini. She said here, this is not just a European crisis, it's a regional and a global crisis. If you look at the number of Syrians, you have 8 million internally displaced people still in Syria, 4 million in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. You have something like 350,000 refugees in Europe. This was a couple of months ago. One number tells everything. The percentage of refugees of the total population of Europe is 0.1%. 0.1%. In Lebanon, it is 25% of the population. We have to put these things in perspective. I would say that's true for us on steroids. We have to stop the hysteria. We have to stop the racism, the Islamophobia. This claim from some, there's been a contest. Who can get deepest into the pit of racism and Islamophobia here among our governors, our congresspeople, our senators, our mayors? I was thinking that it was Ted Cruz for a while, because he was the one who said, we only will take Christians because they could never be terrorists. I guess he forgot about Timothy McVeigh. He forgot about a few other Christian terrorists that we've had around. Then I thought, well, maybe it's Governor Pence. You know what he said. But today I think Governor Pence, well, then there's been a lot of competition here. Then there was Craig Christie, not Craig, what's his first name? Chris Christie, sorry.
Chris Christie.
Yeah, Christie. He said that no Syrians should be allowed. And they pressed him on it and said, what about a 5-year-old orphan? And he said, not even a 5-year-old orphan. He was channeling the US general during the Indian Wars, who was asked when he ordered his soldiers to kill them all when they were surrounding an Indian camp. And the soldiers came back and said, even the babies? And he said, even the babies, nits make lice. It's a famous statement from a US famous general. That's who he was channeling. Now we have a new contender for the deepest in the pit of racism. That is the mayor of Roanoke, who said just a few hours ago.
Roanoke, we have a Roanoke here.
Sorry, Roanoke, Virginia.
Oh.
You only get one chance. Roanoke, Virginia, the mayor said today that sometimes we have to do hard things to protect our people, just like FDR did when he interned the Japanese, and that protected us from our enemies. Yeah. Who's in the pits here? I don't know how to choose who's the worst. They are chasing each other to the bottom. This is the moment for citizen action. Sit-ins, protests, outrage, lawsuits, all of the above. Against your governor, against our friend whose names you should not forget, but I already have. Adrian Shields, thank you, write it down. Adrian Shields. All of these people should be held responsible for fomenting hate speech. Maybe that's illegal in your state. In many states it is. If it is, try and get a criminal investigation, not just a civil lawsuit against the governor, a criminal investigation, that they are fomenting hate. Imagine what the lesson is to our school children. The school children should be the plaintiffs in the lawsuit. They are being denied the right to ever meet a Syrian. We're supposed to live in freedom. We're supposed to have freedom of association, freedom of learning, freedom of thought. We're being stripped of all of that. So, what do we do about all this? The president of France, ironically enough, even while he's channeling George Bush in going to war against terrorism when we know terrorism thrives on war, he's not channeling George Bush on the question of the refugees. Just today he said, some have wanted to link the influx of refugees to Friday's acts of terror. But 30,000 refugees will still be welcomed in the next 2 years. He said France has a simultaneous duty to ensure humanity for refugees and protection of the French people. Should the US be doing any less than France right now? Do we have to take the lesson from France, who have suffered this horrific attack, about how to deal with refugees in the wake of such an attack? Apparently we do. We haven't done so well here. So let me just say, because I want to finish so in time for us to have time for questions and comments and that sort of thing. We are never faced with a situation of war or nothing. But a lot of times it's hard because we think we are. People don't know in their head, like, what are the alternatives? So let me give you just a few to go home with. Start with number one, do no harm. It's like the Hippocratic oath that doctors take. Whatever you do to your patient, don't make it worse. That's the first lesson. Stop killing more people. Stop killing them. Stop the airstrikes. Stop the drone strikes. Number two, you claim there's no boots on the ground. Make that real. Withdraw the troops. Withdraw the 3,500 US troops in occupying Iraq. Withdraw the 50 that we know about in Syria. Withdraw all the ones we don't know about with their sneakers as well as boots. Number three, stop sending more weapons. They all end up in the hands of extremists. None of it is doing any good to anybody. Stop it. Start imposing the Leahy law that says it's illegal to send arms to any military institution that has a pattern and practice of human rights violations. You can't, what's that expression? You can't hurl a cat, you can't twirl a cat, something like that, without hitting something. Well, in this case, you can't twirl a cat in these regions where this war is going on without hitting a human rights violator. Stop it altogether. We need a bunch of new diplomatic initiatives. Some of that is finally beginning, but it's never going to work as long as we're continuing to send weapons. And we need to increase our support for the UN efforts, massive new support for efforts to go after those who are funding ISIS. That means going after the oil companies. It means going after the Saudi money trail, all of that. And finally, massive increase in our humanitarian support. All the UN agencies are defunding their programs because they don't have the money. We need more money to go. That $94 million of your tax money, it should be going to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees right now. Let me stop there.
We have some time for some questions, and so I'd ask, we want to have as many questions as possible, so I'd ask that you try to not make any speeches, but just ask your question, and we'll let Phyllis then answer them, and we'll keep going around the room with the time allotted. Phyllis, I'll ask you to repeat the question since we don't have a handheld mic. So who'd like to start us off? Tony, go ahead.
Yes, do you know why I like in Paris? Why this? I don't understand why people want to shoot somebody in Paris. I mean, a lot of people got there's terrorists in Paris. Do you know why terrorists want to strike Paris? Do you know why?
The question was, why would terrorists strike in Paris?
Yes.
Why would they keep people in Paris? I think there's two parts to the answer. One part is the nature of terrorism is that it's not usually aimed at the person who's actually the victim of it. Terrorism isn't like just murder when you go after a certain person, you want to kill them. Terrorism is designed to make everybody feel afraid. Because everybody thinks, and it's true, it could have been me. It could have been anybody who was out for dinner that night, who was out watching the football game, who was out at the music club. It could be anyone. That's the goal. It's to make everyone afraid. Now the question of why Paris, I'm not in the room with any terrorists figuring out what their target should be. But I think we should assume that it's not a coincidence that the recent batch of terrorist attacks have all been against countries who have recently escalated their attacks in Syria. So the attack on the Russian plane, the attack in Paris, and the attack in Beirut, where Hezbollah is one of the powers in Beirut. It's not the government, but it's in the government. They have all escalated their military roles of various sorts in Syria. Now that's not a guarantee of why Paris was chosen, but it's not something we can dismiss out of hand. The bottom line is, terrorism is designed to frighten people. It's not aimed at anybody in particular, it's aimed to make everybody feel vulnerable. And when you attack a world city, which is the favorite city for so many people around the world, it hits very close to home, and it really works to make everybody feel vulnerable.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Ghana. He's a physician.
Actually, I want to make a comment more than a question, because I'm a Syrian American.
Can you come up?
Please, Amar.
Amar, introduce yourself and the organization that you want to
Sure. I'm Amar Ghanan. I'm a physician here locally in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And I work with an organization called the Syrian American Medical Society, and probably you know about that organization. And what I want to see here is a comment. I'm a Syrian American, and I know what's going on back home. I want to compliment what you have said. I really appreciate all the truth that you are trying to tell. You know the truth, and you communicated that very well. So that's the first thing I want to compliment what she had said. The second thing, I think we have to know that we have to go, when we fight terrorism, we have to go like after the cause, root of the problem, not like the results of the problem. So if we continue doing like just trying to kill these terrorists, it's not going to work, the strategy is not working, we have to go against the root cause of the problem, which is Assad and violence in the Middle East. If we don't get rid of Assad, we're not going to be able to get rid of terrorists inside Syria. And the third part I want to mention here, as an American, Syrian American here, I think that the issue is not related to the refugees, as you mentioned. It's related to our values. We have to fight for our values. And our values is like, as we all know, like stand for discrimination and racism. That's what we need to fight for. It's not the matter of only like preventing refugees from coming here. We have to prevent these politicians from changing our values or like stealing our values. I would actually recommend you to be a top advisor, maybe for administration. And I guarantee everybody here, we can solve all the issues in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amar. I appreciate that. I don't expect to get a White House call tomorrow. I would just say that I think the range of opinion of Syrians is very wide about the roots of the problem. What I think most would agree with, and what I hope that people here would agree with, is that it's up to the Syrians to decide what to do about Assad. It would be disastrous for the US to take the responsibility to carry out regime change in Syria, because it would leave behind what was left behind in Iraq. Assad, I agree with you, is a huge problem. He's collaborated with the US in the global war on terror. The torture of Maher Arar, a Canadian citizen who was one of many tortured by the Syrians at the request of the United States in what was known as extraordinary rendition. There are many stories like this. And yet, at this stage, I think ending the war must still be our priority, and I would hope that we would not take the position that it is up to the United States to be the instrument by which Assad is removed. I appreciate your comments very, very much.
Please.
Well, I don't know what to say. I have family members and friends. In fact, I got a hot argument this afternoon because of Obama being criticized, not doing anything, just sitting on his hands and laying there. And I said, what are we supposed to do? I said, ISIS is all over the world.
Okay, this is sort of this is kind of two questions. The first question is, ISIS is all over the world. What are we supposed to do about that?
Well, they attack about 5 countries at the same time.
The other question is, people claim, and she believes falsely, that Obama is doing nothing, sitting on his hands, and why isn't he doing something? Those two are related, but they're somewhat different questions. Let me take the first one first, on ISIS. ISIS is not all over the world. What is true is that terrorists in many parts of the world have chosen to take the name ISIS because it instills fear in people. For the same way that people, right after 9/11, in all over the place, the US, in a slightly different way, but the same phenomenon, the US government was assigning to, for example, a group of thugs on one of the southern islands in the Philippines who had been terrorizing the local population in the name of a perverted form of Islam. They were called the Abu Sayyaf organization. And the US suddenly decided to use that as an excuse to send troops in massive numbers to the Philippines, which they wanted to do. So what they did was announce that Abu Sayyaf is not a bunch of local thugs, but is rather the Southeast Asian branch of Al-Qaeda. And that somehow then justified the US to send a bunch of troops. Now, the terrorists themselves in some areas seem to have picked up on that trick. So you have, for example, in Afghanistan, we heard a recent report, ISIS is in Afghanistan. It's not. It's a split from the Taliban that there's been fighting going on all year inside the Taliban. There's a leadership struggle essentially going on. And one of the factions of the Taliban decided they were going to ally themselves with ISIS, which means nothing more than taking on the name ISIS in Afghanistan, because that instills fear and makes them appear far stronger, more powerful, more influential, etc. They're the same terrorists that have been terrorizing local people all along. The same in the Sinai, the group that brought down the plane, from what we know. There's no evidence yet that the ISIS leadership which is in a specific place in Raqqa, in Syria, in a city, in the territory they control, there's no evidence that they had anything to do with it. It was a group that's been operating for several years already in the Sinai, challenging primarily the Egyptian government. And they are now calling themselves the Sinai, not the Sinai state, the Sinai province of the Islamic State. It's like, okay, they're not new, they're not ISIS, they're just using the name to frighten people. So that's the first part. The second part, Obama's just sitting on his hands and not doing anything. On a certain level, I wish that were true, because the definition of doing anything usually means doing anything military. Obama is doing a ton militarily, and it's all pretty bad. What he's not doing, the only thing he's not doing, is sending ground troops. And he's been very good at talking about why that wouldn't work. The problem is he wants to have ground troops, but from Saudi Arabia instead, or from somewhere else. What he is doing is sending airstrikes, sending drone strikes more than George Bush ever dreamed of, and killing a whole lot of people. That's what he's doing. It's not working. Your friends are right when they say what Obama's doing isn't working. We've got terrorism everywhere. An aspect of that is right, because, you can say it with me, terrorism survives war. That's the bottom line. This kind of war is never going to wipe out terrorism. We have to do something else.
I got the impression that she was upset because he didn't have about 100,000.
Right. There are people who want there to be ground troops. For those people, I'll give you a hint. Many of you are going home next week or having family come and visit for Thanksgiving, thinking, geez, how are we going to have this conversation without a crazy Uncle Bill going nuts at the table? Remind people who say, we need to send troops, God damn it, we've got to do something about these people. The answer is, we've been doing that for 15 years. Where did it get us exactly? The definition of being crazy for Albert Einstein, I see the nods, you all know it, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. It's never going to work. It hasn't worked for 15 years. It's not going to work now. We need to do something different. It's not going to be as dramatic. It's not going to be as fast. It's not going to be as exciting. And it probably, unfortunately, won't save some people who are currently at risk. On the other hand, our military actions almost certainly won't either.
Ahmed.
Just a quick question about the current conflation of the refugee crisis and associating that with ISIS coming into the U.S. in light of the fact that the two who so far identified as committing the Paris attacks were not actually refugees, but European born and raised for the most part, and how we seem to be missing the historical, or let's not get into that, but just the fact that there's a lot of issues that have led those people from the inside to perform such a heinous act. And that's not associated with refugees coming in. If you can address that a little bit.
Yeah, it's true, this really does have nothing to do with refugees. There's apparently some new, oh sorry, the question was about refugees. There's a disconnect that doesn't get acknowledged. We get told that there is a link between the refugee crisis and the Paris attacks, when in fact, the people who have been identified so far are French and Belgian nationals, born and raised in France or Belgium. There is apparently some report about someone else who came in through Greece that just came in this afternoon. I haven't gotten the details of it yet. So it's possible. I mean, we should not be in the position of lying to people. It is not impossible that among the refugees are people who wish us ill. That's certainly possible. On the other hand, in the last years, since 9/11, the US has welcomed about 800,000 refugees to the United States. It's about as many as Germany said they will take this year, just for comparison's sake, as refugees. But that's what we've taken. Not one has even been accused of carrying out or plotting or thinking about a terrorist act against the United States. Not one. Not one. So that's the first, sort of distinction. The people fleeing, the refugees are fleeing ISIS as much as they are fleeing Assad and fleeing US bombing. They are fleeing all of it. They are fleeing a desperate war. Now, are there people who might try and take advantage of that? It is possible. Can we, in this country awash with guns, really prevent mass killings? Obviously not. What terrifies me is that the next crazed individual who's going to shoot up a school or shoot up a movie theater with the gun they bought legally at Walmart is going to say, I am ISIS, and this country is going to go ballistic. That is the threat that we have. That's a far greater threat than that of a desperate refugee coming to the US across the ocean where they don't know their way around, they don't know people, they don't have the connections to get weapons, to know the city, all these things. Whoever carried out these actions in Paris, they knew exactly where they were going, they knew the neighborhoods, they knew how to rent cars. These were not newcomers. These were people who had been living there. They were born there. They spoke the language. This is a very different situation.
Another question? Jay.
I was in Senator Donnelly's office yesterday. He happens to be our senator in Washington, D.C. Moderate senator. But he's a Democrat. He has to play the middle line, though, because he's in a Republican state. And I heard at least 2 calls while I was just sitting there waiting for my appointment, of people calling in about walls being built and their desire for that to happen, and all about being fearful and highly motivated because of their fear to want the senator to vote for keeping immigrants and refugees out of this country. And so I'm assuming that my 10 minutes waiting in the office and the calls that I heard come in are those individuals who are using this as an opportunity to promote their concerns, where the millions upon millions of Americans who are not